Hello, this is Ben119 and welcome back to another video. So today I'm going to be ranking all the dungeons in Twilight Princess HD, and I'm going to be talking about why I like them, why I dislike them. It's basically going to be a top 9 video. It's going to be similar to the top 9 bosses I did. I'm not sure if you've seen it, but I've made a video for the top 9 bosses in Twilight Princess. And in that video I basically ranked the bosses, I based it off the music, the gameplay, the atmosphere. But in this video I'm actually not going to be giving the dungeons like an actual rating, I'm just going to be putting them in order from worst to best. And I think the reason I'm doing that is because even though a dungeon can be really good, and there is some dungeons that I think are really good, but I personally just don't like them. I don't think you can really just base a dungeon based on how good it is technically, because you still might not enjoy it as a dungeon, so it doesn't necessarily mean that you'll give it a high ranking. But yeah, I'm just going to talk about why I like a dungeon. Like, there is some dungeons that are like quite high on the list that I like just because I like them, because they're good. Also, the boss of the dungeon will not make a difference on the list, because the boss is like a completely different part to me. And just because a boss is good or bad, it won't make the dungeon better or worse. I'm just going to rate the dungeon. If you want to see the bosses, then watch my top 9 bosses video, because I've already done a rating for them. And yeah, let's just jump into the list. So at number 9 on my list is probably the only dungeon I actually don't enjoy playing, and that is the Palace of Twilight. Now, the Palace of Twilight technically is a pretty good dungeon, and it's got some clever ideas in there, but I just personally don't like it. Now, the thing is with the Palace of Twilight is there's not really a major dungeon item that you get. It's the second to last dungeon in the game as well, and the item you get is you just get your Master Sword powered up. And the dungeon is just really boring to me because there's not really that much exploring, and it's basically just following straight lines of rooms, and then you go into like the other side of the dungeon, you go in a straight line again, and there is a bit of key searching I guess in the rooms, and the rooms are quite big, but the overall style of the dungeon I'm just not a fan of, to be honest. And I think some of the gameplay is quite lazy as well. There's a lot of fighting enemies, and there's like mini boss fights with Phantom Zant, which I think is a really poor mini boss, to be honest. I think that the idea of carrying the orb away from the hand is pretty cool, but I think they could have done more with it, and they could have maybe made it more difficult, and they could have had some more urgency in there, because the hand does move quite slow and it is pretty easy to get away from him. I do like the platforms that appear once you have your charged up Master Sword. That is quite a cool idea, how they move about, and I think that's pretty cool. I think the boss key is quite well hidden. I think that's obviously really cool. The dungeon overall is just not that fun to play through, and there's a lot of waiting, and it's a very repetitive dungeon, and it's quite long as well. But I can kind of see why people would like it, and it's just a little bit disappointing to me as the second to last dungeon, because I feel like they could have done so much more with it. They could have used the dungeon items better, they could have included items from earlier in the game more often, and it just could have been more challenging and unique. But yeah, that's why it's at number 9. Let's move on to the next one. So at number 8 on my list is Hyrule Castle, which is the final dungeon in the game. And to put the final dungeon at number 8 on the list is quite surprising, but I'm just not a huge fan of the final dungeon. I don't mind playing it. Like, it's not like the Palace of Twilight where I don't want to play it. Like, I actually don't mind playing this dungeon. But again, with this dungeon, I feel like it could have been a lot better than it was, and I feel like they could have done more with it, and it could have been more challenging. Let's talk about what I like. So I quite like the mini boss fight with King Bulblin. That's a pretty cool mini boss fight that you have to do with him to get the key that opens the front door to the castle. I think that's really good. I like all the Dark Nut fights with the big knights. That's all really cool. And there's some pretty good puzzles in there. And the final staircase leading up to the boss door is really cool, and I love the atmosphere. And there is a few good puzzles. The hidden graveyard's pretty cool, but I think there is some missed potential there. I feel like with the hidden graveyard they could have done more with it, and they could have made it more challenging. They could have had more enemies in there, but instead it's just like a little puzzle you have to do to get to an extra key that gives you access to loads of chests at the end of the dungeon. I do like the idea of having a hidden key and then having loads of chests you can access with it right at the end. I think that's a really good detail, and I think that the dungeon is, even though I did say that it's not that challenging, I think there is some challenging parts to it. I just feel like as a final dungeon it just could have been harder. So yeah, that's what I think of the dungeon. I think what they could do to improve it is maybe have more key searching, and they could have a more non-linear layout to it. They could maybe have more trials as well once you're in the castle. There could be more puzzles, there could be more enemies, they could have harder enemies. And the one thing I was a bit disappointed about was the boss key. Now, the boss key chest is on the castle walls, and you basically see it, and a load of enemies start running towards you, and then the group of people you were helping in the game, earlier on in the game, basically save you from the enemies. But my problem with that is that the enemies they save you from would have been really easy to kill anyway, and it just feels like it's really weirdly implemented to have those people there, and I don't really think that it does much for me. Like, I guess it's a cool moment, but at the same time I don't think it's really needed, and I feel like they could have had a more memorable puzzle or fight to get to the boss key. I think that was kind of needed. But yeah, it's a good dungeon. I do really like the final part where you go up the staircase and the Darknut fight before the final boss. That's obviously really cool. But yeah, that's my overall thoughts on dungeon. Let's move on to the next one. So at number 7 on my list is the Temple of Time. And the Temple of Time is a pretty good dungeon, and there is quite a few things I like about this dungeon. So I do like the statues. Once you get the Dominion Rod, it is pretty cool controlling the big statue. And I do like the concept of having to get the statue all the way from the top of the dungeon to the bottom of the dungeon. And I think the dungeon is designed quite well for that. And when you're first playing the dungeon, you may think like this dungeon's really boring, it's really linear. But on the way down, it does become a bit more non-linear, I guess. And the puzzles do make more sense, because there's some rooms that may not look like a puzzle, but then when you come back to them, it's kind of a puzzle because you have to do stuff. For example, the room with the scales, there's like a simple scale puzzle you can do, and it's quite easy to do the first time, but the second time you've got this big statue with you, and you have to balance out the scales with other things, and obviously that the statue is heavy, you have to put a lot on there to balance it, so that's pretty cool. The one thing I don't really like about this dungeon is the fact that it's really linear and there's not really much going off track, and it's mainly just following one path. The reason I don't like that is because in dungeons I really like it when there's a main room that you always go back to that keeps changing. For example, with like Lakebed Temple, like obviously the main room in that dungeon is really good. But with this dungeon, for example, there's not really a set main room. There's like 2 rooms in particular that are quite big, but I wouldn't even consider them main rooms because you've only got like one other room branching off them. The boss key is pretty cool. I do like to talk about the boss key puzzle because I think that's quite an important detail to a dungeon. And the boss key puzzle is pretty good, and I do like the fact that you have to use the claw shot to get one of the shell things, like one of the metal shells up to the switches. It's quite clever how you have to do that, to think to do that. It uses some of the items quite well. It uses the bow quite well with some of the puzzles in this dungeon, especially the switch puzzles, so you have to hit the switch through different rings. It uses a spinner a few times as well in the claw shot, and the Dominion Rod is used quite well, and later on there's some pretty good puzzles with it. And the mini-boss is pretty cool. Darknut is a good mini-boss. And yeah, it's a pretty fun dungeon. It's just, in my opinion, I don't really enjoy it that much with some parts of it. But there is a lot of it that I do enjoy. And yeah, that's kind of my opinion on this dungeon. I do think it could be better if there was more exploring to do and it was less linear. But at the same time, it is unique. But it's just not quite for me. But it's still a really good dungeon. So yeah, let's move on to the next dungeon. So at number 6 on my list is the Goron Mines, and the Goron Mines is a pretty good dungeon, and the reason why I like this dungeon is because of the iron boots and the way it uses the iron boots. Now, even though the dungeon item is the bow, I do feel like the bow is a little bit underused, 1 because you get it quite close to the end of the dungeon, and 2 because I feel like the iron boots just steal the show for this dungeon. Because there's all these like blue platforms that you can walk on, and it introduces that mechanic in the dungeon, and there's a lot of really good puzzles with it, and it's a really fun mechanic as well. My only problem with the mechanic is that the iron boots are quite slow and Link moves quite slow. But at the same time, it's still really cool, and if you've got more patience than me, then you'll probably enjoy it more. But yeah, I still really enjoy that mechanic. It's just once you've played the dungeon so many times, you do start to get a little bit bored. But that's just me, to be honest. The rest of the dungeon is really well designed. It's fairly linear. It's kind of on the linear side, to be honest. Like, there's not a lot of branching off and going into different sections. Like, you kind of just follow one path for a lot of it. But at the same time, it is designed quite well, and there's a lot of good enemies. I like the Zalfos, like the Dongo things. Not the Zalfos, the Dongos. I get them mixed up, sorry. There's some pretty good puzzles in there as well. I like all the moments where you use the iron boots, like I was saying. I like the bit where you take a leap of faith off the platform and you land inside one of the magnets and you get dragged onto a wall. That bit's really cool. I like the mini boss, even though I'm not talking too much about mini bosses. The mini boss is really cool in this dungeon, where you have to go on the wrestling ring with the big Goron, and you have to throw him off into the lava 3 times. That's a really cool use. The bow is used quite well. Like, you can use it to knock down like bridges, you can use it to kill the eye enemies. And I really like the puzzle near the end of the dungeon where you have to go upside down on one of the blue platforms and you have to shoot a bridge as you're moving. That's really cool, just before you get to the boss door. And also the boss key is quite unique in this dungeon, because rather than just getting the boss key in a chest, you have to find these 3 secret rooms. And these Gorons basically give you like each third of the boss key. So you have to make sure to get all 3 before you get to the boss door as well. So yeah, it's a pretty good dungeon. I do like it, and I think it's got some really cool mechanics in there. And for a second dungeon, it's pretty solid. So yeah, that's my opinion. Let's move on to the next dungeon. At number 5 on my list is the Forest Temple. And the Forest Temple is a really cool dungeon, and for a first dungeon it is probably my favourite first dungeon in any Zelda game ever, because it's really well designed and it's not simple as well. Like, there is quite a few good puzzles and you do have to use your brain quite a lot. Like, for example, with the Great Deku Tree in Ocarina of Time, it's very straightforward, it's very short, and it just serves as like a 15-minute tutorial before you get into the game. But with this dungeon here, like, there's quite a lot going on. There's having to find all the monkeys, there's switch puzzles, there's, once you get the boomerang, there's some pretty good puzzles there. And I do like the first half of the dungeon because you go out and there's this big bridge that leads across to the door, which leads to the mini boss, and the mini boss comes out on the other side and knocks down the bridge. So then you have to basically find a load of monkeys, and once you've got enough monkeys you can then get across to the mini boss. And looking for the monkeys is pretty good as well, because there's like a left side and a right side to the dungeon. And even though like it is the first dungeon, it is kind of like complicated, but at the same time like the dungeon is kind of split into sections. Like, you got the right side and you got the left side, and there's different puzzles and there's these different doors with rooms, and there's basically monkeys hidden in some of them. And there's like kind of main rooms, like there's a main room on the left side and there's a main room on the right side. And then you've also got like the side which the mini boss is on, and you unlock that side once you get the boomerang, because you're able to move the wind bridges. And I think that being able to move the wind bridges is a really cool mechanic, and there is some instances later on where you have to join up like 2 bridges together and you have to keep moving them. The boomerang is really well used. Like, it's really cool how you can use it to pick up items like bombs, because you have to do that later on towards the end of the dungeon to get one of the last monkeys. I also like the boomerang with how you can stun enemies. That can be helpful. And the boss key chest is pretty good. You have to basically hit 4 switches in a row, and you have to basically hit them in a certain order for the gate to open. And I also like how the dungeon is just designed, like, in general, because it's really cool. Like, even when you start out playing it, like, it's not that hard to get lost, to be honest, because even though it is quite big, like, you will find your way back to like a main room or whatever. So yeah, it's a really well made dungeon, and for a first dungeon it's really cool. The only thing I don't like about it, and this isn't even like a complaint, I do think it is a little bit long for a first dungeon. It is about 40 minutes. If you don't know what you're doing, it could be like an hour and a half even. But if you know what you're doing, it's about 40 minutes. And for a first dungeon, I think that's a little bit too long. I think a first dungeon should be around 20 minutes. But yeah, I'm not complaining about the length, because obviously if it's longer there's going to be more to do. So yeah. That's my opinion on that dungeon, and that's why it's number 5 on the list. Let's move on. Okay, so at number 4 on my list is the Arbiters Grounds, and this is where we really get into like the really solid dungeons. Like, these last 4 dungeons are all really good, and they are like my favourite dungeons in the series. So Arbiters Grounds is an amazing dungeon, and I love the dungeon item. The spinner is one of the best items in any game ever. And the one thing I don't like about the dungeon is you get the spinner like 10 minutes before the end of the dungeon. I just wish you got the spinner earlier in the dungeon, because it could have been a way better dungeon. It's still an amazing dungeon, but it could have been even better, because there would have been more to do with the spinner. There would have been more instances where you go across gaps, and they could have got you more used to the spinner before the end of the dungeon, because I feel like the thing is, you get the spinner and then they expect you to use it in really crazy ways, and if you're a beginner and you've not really played like many games, like you might find it quite difficult to use the spinner because it can be quite hard to like control and you have to like jump off things and stuff. But other than that, I think the whole dungeon's really amazing. I like having to track down the 4 Poes. I know it is kind of copied from the Forest Temple in Ocarina of Time, but I do think it's still really cool how you have to do that, and there are some really good puzzles. For example, in the first like main room with the torches, you can follow a scent with Wolf Link, and it basically unlocks a hidden staircase and it leads down to a different room. And you are basically underneath a different room that you were in before, and you can create a gap and you can claw shut up through the gap, and it basically creates like a extra door that you can then access, which wasn't there before because the room had spun round. It's quite complicated to explain, but there's a lot of good puzzles where you have to move like the walls around and it opens up new parts to explore. Also, I like the statue puzzle where if you light the wrong torch, loads of bugs start trying to kill you and skeletons, because I think that's quite a good puzzle. You can also figure it out by using the scent. Spoiler alert. The Poe fights are pretty cool, like the one you have to do near the end, where you have to fight him, and there's like 4 Poes, and one of them's the real one and the other's a fake, so that's pretty cool. The first half is just really solid, and there's some good puzzles, and it's just really fun to play through, and there's a lot of exploring. It's quite non-linear in places. And then you've got the second half, which the second half is really fun because you get the spinner, and there's like this big elevator you can go down, which you first get to, and like the mini boss is amazing. Like the mini boss is really scary looking, and it's really unusual as well. I like the spikes that spin around in the room before that create like a death trap if you get hit, and you can see there's like skulls attached to it, which is like a really cool detail to show that it's killed people before. Another thing I'm a little bit disappointed about in this dungeon is the boss key, because the boss key is not really hidden at all. Basically, you do the big spinner room, and you get to the end of it, and the boss key chest is basically right there, and there's literally no way you can miss it. It's basically easier to get the boss key than it is to go out of your way and not get it. I just feel like they could have maybe hidden the boss key chest somewhere else in the dungeon, and it would have been a better place to put it. It's still really solid though, and I do like the spinner puzzles where you have to go in like the gap and you can spin the walls around, and it basically changes which room is open. I like how you can lift up this big spinner track to get to the boss door as well. Overall, extremely solid dungeon. It's really fun to play through, good use of items, and it's really creative as well. So yeah, let's move on to number 3. So at number 3 on my list is Snowpeak Ruins, and for some reason I absolutely love this dungeon. I'm not sure about anyone else, but I just really enjoy this dungeon for some reason, and I can't get enough of it. So the thing I love about this dungeon is the fact that it's like a mansion, and the layout of the dungeon basically fits within the mansion. And the thing is with dungeons, even though I love dungeons, they're a bit weird. They're a weird concept, to be honest. Like, you got all these random rooms branching off in directions. Like, for example, I love City in the Sky, but at the same time, like, that dungeon is really strange and is very random. But with a dungeon like Snowpeak Ruins, you can tell that it was actually some kind of structure before it became a dungeon. And it actually works like an actual house. Like, you got like a kitchen, there's like armory rooms, there's a bedroom, there's all these different rooms, and you can tell that they serve some kind of purpose. So when you explore, and you can see that some rooms are locked, and that would kind of make sense, to be honest, because some rooms probably would be locked behind doors. So keys do make sense in this dungeon as well. There's a lot of really good puzzles. Now, the dungeon item is the ball and chain. The ball and chain is a really well used item. You can use it to take out the ice. You can kill loads of enemies at once. You can use it to move the chandeliers, so you can jump across to get to places. And I love the way this dungeon works, because for example, when you first start the dungeon, you only have access to one side of the first floor, and then you have access to another side of the first floor, and then you get the dungeon item, and then you can go on the second floor, and then you can do loads of stuff on the second floor, and then you can get access to the third floor, for example. Now, that does sound quite linear, but at the same time, once you get the ball and chain, there is quite a lot to explore, and there's a lot to do if you go out of your way, and there's different entrances you can open, and there's a lot of key searching as well, which is fun. I like how you have to play as Wolf Link in one part, where you can dig out a chest that's buried in the snow. That's really well hidden and cool. Also, the cannonballs is a really nice concept. I like how you have to get a cannonball to the second floor, and you have to get it into one of the cannons in the outside part of the dungeon, like the outside main room, to kill one of the ice enemies. I think that's a really cool puzzle, and I like how you have to get a cannonball all the way from the bottom floor to the second floor, and you basically have to get it through a few different rooms in the mansion. And that works really well in my opinion. The ball and chain, like I was saying, is really well used, and I really like the block puzzle, and I like how you have to do the block puzzle twice, because the first time you do the puzzle, it's fairly simple, and you just have to get the block on one switch, but later on, there's basically more blocks involved, and you have to get 2 switches activated at once, so that you have to basically have a better understanding of how it all works. And once you do that, you basically unlock another door that leads to a different part of the dungeon. And yeah, it's a really amazing dungeon. I love the layout of it. I love playing this dungeon. It is slightly shorter than the rest of the dungeons. It's not even a short dungeon, it's still like a good 40 minutes. But it's not like over an hour, unless you don't really know what you're doing, then it'll probably take over an hour. But yeah, it's an amazing dungeon. I love the layout, I love the theme, I love the ball and chain. And the puzzles are really cool, and it all looks really nice. So yeah, that is my number 3 spot. Let's move on to number 2. So at number 2 on my list is the Lakebed Temple, and the Lakebed Temple is my favourite water dungeon in any Zelda game. And it's just such an amazing dungeon, and for being the 3rd dungeon, it is extremely challenging, and it is very full on for a 3rd dungeon in my opinion, and there's a lot to do. Now this dungeon is extremely long, it'll definitely take you way over an hour your first time playing it. And the dungeon item is the claw shot, and the claw shot is one of my favourite items in any Zelda game. Obviously it's everyone's like favourite item I guess, because of what you can do with it. And the reason I like this dungeon is because there's a lot of swimming, there's a lot of puzzles on land, there's a lot of using your water to your advantage. Because basically the whole concept of the dungeon is the main room, you got the main room, and you have to basically fill the main room with water so you can then access the boss door. However, the room has not really got much water in it at first, and you have to go into the side room. So there's a big section to the left and there's a big section to the right. And there's a rotating staircase in the main room. And what you have to do is you have to go on the other side of the dungeon and you have to get the parts moving. And you have to basically send water from those sides of the dungeon to the middle. And also you can then send that water to the other side of the dungeon, which basically makes stuff happen on that side. Also you can then access water on the other side, and you can then send that into the main room again, and you can also send that same water into the other room again to make water raise up to get to a secret chest. That's kind of like a different thing though. I really love how there is so many puzzles as well. There's a lot of opening things, there's a lot of finding keys and going through doors and basically going into different rooms and then coming back. It's a very non-linear dungeon, to be honest. Like, it's the most non-linear dungeon in the game probably, and I love how there's so many different ways you can get to certain rooms as well. Like, there's a lot of different floors as well. It uses the claw shot very well. You got the spinning wheels, and they have claw shot targets on top of them, and you can claw shot onto them and move around. The boss key is pretty well hidden. I do like the boss key, and I like how you have to dangle down on the claw shot and then drop down into where the boss key is. Even the swimming, even though I'm not a huge fan of swimming, I don't think a lot of people are, it uses the swimming very well, and it knows like the balance to like swim into like land in this dungeon. I think there is quite a bit of swimming, but at the same time there is a lot of land, and I would say there is more land than swimming, which is not a bad thing because there is still a lot of water, and just because it's a water temple, it doesn't mean that every second has to be spent underwater. I think that's good that the game realised that. The whole temple looks really nice as well. Like, I really like the way it looks, which is obviously good. And it's just such a clever dungeon, and it's hard to explain why it's so good, but once you play it, and once you understand how the dungeon works, you'll have an appreciation for the dungeon that you probably don't have now if you've not played it. And yeah, like I was saying before, it is a very complicated dungeon for the 3rd dungeon in the game. Like, it's not extremely complicated, but for a 3rd dungeon I'd say it is. And there's just a lot to do, and there's loads of secrets, and yeah, it's just great. I'm going to move on to number 1 now. So at number 1 on my list, and my favourite dungeon in Twilight Princess, is City in the Sky. And City in the Sky is almost a flawless dungeon in my opinion. It is almost perfect. And it's just the best thing to play in Twilight Princess, and I always look forward to it every time I play through Twilight Princess. And it's just such a fun dungeon. The dungeon item is the double claw shot, and basically once you get the double claw shot, you can claw shot onto things and then you can re-claw shot after claw shotting once, so you can basically be like Spider-Man. You can just claw shot onto everything, and the whole dungeon's just so much fun, and once you do get the double claw shot, it opens up the dungeon a lot more, and just exploring the dungeon is just fun. And basically, even before you get the double claw shot, you still have the regular claw shot. And I like how once you go to one side of the dungeon, you get a key and then you come back, and the boss of the dungeon then knocks down a bridge, and you can't get to that side again until you get the double claw shot. And once you do, you can then claw shot across to that side. And once you get to that side of the dungeon, there is so much to do. Like, there's this huge room with claw shot targets everywhere, and it's like a big puzzle, and if you fall off, you fall down and die. There's loads of rooms that have loads of claw shot targets, and it's just a really fun dungeon to play. There's a lot of clever puzzles as well. I like the puzzle where you get the boss key, and straight after getting the boss key, you have to dangle down into the main room and hit a switch from above to open. Well, not open, you have to stop one of the fans from moving, which I think is extremely clever. Also, earlier in the dungeon, I do quite like the use of the iron boots to avoid getting blown by the wind. I do think that's quite clever as well, and it is used quite well. I also like the ukus. The ukus are a clever concept which are used a lot in the first half of the dungeon but aren't really used in the second half. And I like how you have to fly into like the updrafts of wind, and you can then get to like different places from there, and it is quite a clever concept. The whole dungeon is huge, and it will definitely take you over an hour playing it for your first time, and it's just so well designed. I know I keep saying it's so well designed, but it's one of those dungeons, a bit like what I said about Lakebed Temple, you just need to play it to understand how good it is. Now, the one complaint that some people have with the dungeon is there is waiting sometimes. Like, you sometimes claw shot onto something, you have to wait a little while in order to claw shot onto something else. But I don't really mind that, to be honest, because I think it is quite good. And the whole concept of it is really cool, and it's sometimes quite nice just to be hanging on to one thing, waiting to claw shot onto another thing, and you get to appreciate the dungeon while you're waiting. Like, not everything has to be like constant claw shotting. I do think if the whole dungeon was just constant double claw shotting everywhere, I think the whole dungeon would be over way too quick. So I do like some of the rooms where you do have to wait for things, and it is quite nice. Also, the mini boss is pretty solid. I do like the dragon where you have to claw shot onto his shield and then fight him. That's quite cool. Also, like, the enemies are really cool. I like the armored Lizalfos. They're pretty challenging to fight. There's quite a few of them in this dungeon. The room before the boss key is really cool with the tight ropes and Wolf Link. I think that's really cool because that's not really used very often, the tight ropes. The whole boss is absolutely incredible, but I've gone over that in the top 9 bosses, so watch that if you want to know more about that boss and what I think of it. But the room before the boss door as well is really amazing, with all the moving claw shot targets where you have to go up the room. And it is a very vertical dungeon as well. There's a lot of verticality to it, and there's a lot of going upwards and downwards and across. It's just a very big dungeon to explore as well. And once you do get the double claw shot, like I was saying, it does open up a lot more. And it's good because you can then go back to places that you couldn't do before, and then you can do them because you got the double claw shot. And yeah, this whole dungeon is just absolutely incredible. It's really well designed, it looks amazing, it plays amazing, and it's my favourite dungeon in Twilight Princess, and one of my favourite in the whole series. So yeah, that is my opinion on the dungeons in this game. So yeah. Okay, so this is where all the dungeons ranked on the list, if you forgot where they were. So obviously that is a list right there, feel free to read it. And I would like to know people's opinions below, because I am always interested to see what people think of the dungeons, and what people's favourite dungeon is, what people's worst dungeon is, and why. I will always read comments because I don't get that many comments, to be honest. I've only got 86 subscribers. So whenever I do get comments, I do always appreciate it, and I will take the time to reply. If I do ever get loads of subscribers in the future, I will always try and do that. I doubt I'll ever get to like the stage of not being able to reply to people because I got so many comments. I highly doubt that will happen. Enough of that, but yeah, I really enjoyed making this video. I enjoy making these top 10 videos. They're fun to edit and to voice over as well, and I plan to do more in the future. I was thinking of maybe doing Skyward Sword dungeons maybe next, or doing like all the dungeons like from Zelda games, like a top 10 3D dungeons from all the 3D Zelda games, and getting all the best dungeons from them. I was thinking of maybe doing some more Pikmin stuff. I don't know really, I'll have a think about it, see what I'm in the mood to make. But yeah, thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed the video, please like the video and subscribe if you're new around here. I will see you in the next video. Goodbye.